All right, so I'm going to go through these notes a little bit a different way. I had some issues with the audio, so this is my third time recording these notes. I don't want to write my words again, so I'm going to cover up some things. We're going to talk about some things, and then I'll show you some of the words that you need to add to your notes. Now, you guys have learned about cells before, and you've probably been shown diagrams that look like this and say this is what animal cells look like and this is what plant cells look like. Well, that is mostly not true because most animal cells don't look just like this nice round cell with all these cell parts in it. And also, most plant cells don't look just like this, okay? So cells have different structures that allow them to do different jobs for a multicellular organism. So we're going to see that shapes come in all cells come in all different shapes and sizes. They have different shapes. Cells are going to have different structures. They're going to have different organelles in the cytoplasm, and they're going to make different proteins, which is going to make them look different and be able to perform different jobs for an organism. Now, you should be able to tell me in this unit an example of a specialized cell and tell me what it does, and then tell me what would be some of the unique structures and organelles and proteins that it makes, which will allow it to do that specific job for an organism. So let's take a look at a sperm cell here. And the job of the sperm cell is to find and fertilize an egg. So the unique structures that it's going to have to help it do that would be this tail that flips and spins, and that's going to make the sperm cell move in the direction towards the egg. Notice that this cell doesn't look anything like this one. It doesn't have all these organelles inside of it. And so it has very few organelles in it. And that allows it to be smaller, because smaller things usually can be moved better, especially by a flagella. Now, to move the flagella, it's going to cost a lot of energy. So we're going to see that the sperm cell has a lot of mitochondria. And in that nucleus, you're not going to find all of the chromosomes of an organism. You're actually only going to find the half set, which is 23 when it comes to humans. So sperm cells are only going to live for about 48 hours. They don't need all those additional organelles in there. It just take up space and make them heavier and more difficult to move. And so you can see it's very, very specialized for moving towards an egg and delivering some DNA for offspring. So here's the unique features that I just mentioned here. It has a long flagella, which is going to help it move. It doesn't have most organelles. It does have a lot of mitochondria for that ATP, the energy. The nucleus is going to be different. It's only going to have half the number of chromosomes in it. It's going to be much smaller, and you can also see that it has kind of a pointed head there, and that's going to help it move into the egg whenever it finally gets there. So your red blood cells obviously have a shape that's different than sperm cells. Their job is to bind to oxygen and in the lungs and then carry it to different parts of the body. So you can see that these cells are more round. That helps them get through these narrow passageways. And you are going to see that this is going to lack organelles kind of like this one. You're not going to find a nucleus or rough ER, smooth ER, or any organelles in there because this cell is dead. Now, when it was alive, it had those cell parts and it made a bunch of protein and it filled its cytoplasm with a protein that can bind to oxygen. We've already talked about it, and that would be hemoglobin. So whenever all these cell parts break down, now there's more room in the cytoplasm for all this hemoglobin, which can bind to the oxygen and help those red blood cells do a job, which is carry oxygen to your cells. So let's take a look at some other types of specialized cells. So here we have white blood cells. And if you look in white blood cells, you can see they're going to have a lot of these structures, a lot of lysosomes. So white blood cells fight infection. If there's anything that's foreign to your body, like bacteria or viruses or even things that are not living, your white blood cells can engulf those and will use their lysosomes. See how the lysosomes kind of fuse with that vesicle that had the bacteria in it, and it breaks down the bacteria. So we can say that some unique features for these white blood cells is they have lots of lysosomes that help them break down those microbes. They also have to be able to move to different parts of the body. So they're not anchored down. They can change their shape, they can squeeze through small spaces, and that allows them to find foreign objects and destroy them. Now let's take a look at your cells that line your airway, your windpipe. It's called the trachea. And let's take a look at these right here. These cells have these little hair-like extensions, and those are called cilia. Now, the job of these cells is to move the mucus that lines your airway that traps particles that you breathe in. So when you breathe in like dust and spores and other things that are floating around in the air, those things need a way to get out of your lungs. So you make a bunch of protein mucus that will stick to the mucus, and it's the job of these cells to move the mucus. So the cilia can move, and that's going to make that mucus and those particles that are trapped in it move up and out of your lungs. So some features that this cell would have that lines your airways there is it has cilia. Those cilia will move, and that can move that mucus. So it's going to take a lot of mitochondria to move the mucus and move that the cilia. So that's why I put some extra mitochondria in there as well. So that cell's going to need lots of energy for movement of the cilia. Now let's take a look at cells that line your digestive system. So once again, not circular like you saw on the previous page. So this cell, you can see its membrane goes in and out. So we say that it's folded. Now, in your digestive system, your food particles get broken down, and then these little particles of organic molecules have to be absorbed into the body. So these cells absorb your nutrition into the cell and eventually is going to put them in your bloodstream, and your blood is going to carry those substances to your cells. Now, let's talk about this folded membrane and what we kind of added right here. Most of these particles have to move into the cell and out of your digestive system through proteins that are embedded in the membrane. If the membrane is folded, there's more membrane, and there can be more of these transport proteins embedded all along. If there's more of those, then they can move in more of these substances from your food. So the intestinal cells, or the cells that line your intestines, some unique features about them is they have folded membranes, and that can be called microvilli. So these are really, really tiny folds, so they're called microvilli. And so that increases the surface area, gives us more cell membrane for the nutrients to pass from the digestive system into those cells and into your body. And it also has unique proteins. These little proteins right here aren't made by all types of cells. Those are specific transport proteins, and it's their job to move certain molecules out of your digestive system and into your bloodstream. Take a look at our neurons here. You can see that here's a neuron, I've got another neuron, and I've got another neuron. And the job of your neurons, or your nerve cells, is to detect a stimulus. So we have nerve endings of this cell, and if something touches, so let's say these nerve endings are in your skin. If something touches your skin, it disturbs the cell membrane in that area, and that disturbance sends a signal along the length of the nerve. And that signal can go to other nerve cells, which can then take the message up to like your brain. And your brain can send messages to other nerves that can then cause your muscle cells, so let's draw a muscle, to be able to respond, to pull your arm away from whatever's poking you, okay? So nerve cells detect and transmit signals. Now, one key feature is they're able to detect more if they're branched. So you can see that they have more branching, kind of more folds in their membrane. They also are really long and skinny, and that's going to help them move a message a lot faster and a greater distance. So lots of times you'll see nerves are long and very skinny cells, and that helps them move the signal very quickly from one part of the body to the other. All right, so let's take a look at our plant specialized cells. So if you were to cut a root, so I just have one little part of the root here. You can see the root is made all kinds of different types of cells. Let's take a look at the specialized cell right here. So this is a root cell that has an extension. So this cell membrane and cell wall extends way out. And just like with the folds in the membrane of the cells that line your intestines, this kind of extension out, that cell membrane in that area, there's more room now for these transport proteins that are embedded in the membrane. So now we have transport proteins to help the cell do what it needs to do. It needs to be able to pull in water so that water can come through those proteins. It needs to be able to take minerals out of the soil and bring them into the cell. And eventually these things are going to be moved into other cells and distributed around the plant. So that's the job of root cells, is to take in and transport water and materials out of the soil and into the plant tissue. And so to do that, it's got an extended part of the cell membrane, and this can be called a root hair. So this is the structure right here. It's all part of the cell, but this is called a root hair, and it allows them to absorb more water and minerals. Notice that there's no chloroplast. We do have mitochondria because it's going to take some energy to power those transport proteins, but no mitochondria because the cell's underground, it's in the root. Versus our plant leaf cells here are specialized to receive the sunlight and to do photosynthesis. So to do that, the cell parts that assist in photosynthesis are these chloroplasts here. And you're going to see lots of chloroplasts in those leaf cells. Now, photosynthesis is a process where the plant can take CO2 and water, you guys have learned this in the past, and using light energy can make glucose, which is food for the cell, and it also produces oxygen. Remember, in this process, or in this reaction or series of reactions, what starts over here on the equal sign is called the reactants, and then what's on the other side is called the products. Now, if you look at a leaf cell, you're also going to see that they're going to have really big vacuoles. This is actually a pretty small vacuole compared to what we really see in most leaf cells. And I put some water in there so you know that vacuoles store water, and that's going to be beneficial for this cell because to do photosynthesis, a plant must have water. So if it can store a lot of water, even if it doesn't rain for weeks at a time, then there's still going to be plenty of water so that plant can make its food, can make its glucose. Also notice that you're going to have a thick cell wall around this plant cell. So the plant cells are exposed to wind and rain and hail and debris carried by the wind, so they have to have some extra protection around their cells. And so that's that cell wall. Now we're going to talk about how you got all these different types of cells that look very different. So let's just start with what you looked like about 16 years ago, okay? You were one cell big. This was you. And what happened after an hour or two is this one cell divided into two, and then these two cells divided, and then I had 4 cells, okay? And all these cells, they looked exactly the same to start. And these cells at the beginning are called stem cells. Now, stem cells have the ability to change into any specific or specialized type of cell in the body. And what they change into just depends on what signals they receive. So what I did here is I put on the surface of these cells some proteins. So these are proteins that kind of stick out into the environment. I'm going to put one right here. Okay. So these cells can receive signals, and that's what's going to cause them to turn on different types of genes and turn into these different types of cells. So if this cell receives this signal, so if this molecule from the environment binds to that cell's protein, this cell will turn into, let's say, a nerve cell. Now, if this cell would have gotten that signal, this cell would have turned into a nerve cell, but it didn't. It got a different signal. So let's indicate these are different signals. And since this cell received a different signal, it didn't turn into a nerve cell, it turned into one of your liver cells as your liver was developing before you were born, okay? So stem cells are cells that have not specialized. They can specialize, and they can turn into different types of cells in the body, okay? So it says stem cells are unspecialized cells, but when they are signaled, they can turn into a specific type of cell. Now, when they turn into a different type of cell or a specific type of cell, this is called differentiation. Or we say that the cells are differentiating, becoming different types of cells in an organism. So this is showing you differentiation. Okay. Now, one concept that's kind of difficult for kids to remember or understand is that even though these cells look all different, if these are all your cells, they are genetically identical. And I think students are confused by that because they think of identical twins. They have the same DNA and they look the same. Well, all these cells have the same DNA, however, they look different. So how is that the case? So if we go down to this diagram right here, so let's start with the stem cell. And let's say this stem cell has a signal, gets a signal to turn into a nerve cell. Now let's take a look at what's going to happen. So this stem cell, here's its DNA. So let's indicate that that double helix in there, that's a DNA molecule. And we can see here we've sectioned off a part of the DNA. And I'm going to call this area right here gene A. So let's indicate that's gene A. Okay. And this section down here, so sections of DNA are called genes. This is gene B. Right? Now the reason why this cell turned into a nerve cell is because it has gene A and gene B, but when it got a certain signal, it turned on gene A and made a certain type of protein, but it never turned on gene B. Now let's look over here. Let's take a look at a skin cell in someone. So again, it has DNA. So if this stem cell gets a certain type of signal, then it can cause it to differentiate into a skin cell instead of a nerve cell. And the reason why it'll do that is it has both of those genes as well, but it's going to turn on and off different genes than this cell that turned into the nerve cell. So gene A in this case is off, and then gene B is on. So to kind of give you an example is if this is a skin cell, let's say that this is a skin cell that produces melanin. So I'm showing you it's producing this protein and it transports this protein out of the cell. And it kind of makes a barrier that protects cells from UV light. This gene codes for this cell to make that protein. So this cell will make the melanin. And it then is doing a job for the organism. It's making melanin that can protect cells in the skin. A nerve cell never needs to make melanin. It's not at the surface of your skin. There's not a bunch of these nerve cells that can produce melanin and protect your skin from UV rays. So it doesn't need to turn on that gene because that's not the job of a neuron to make melanin. So it's going to keep that gene off, but it is going to turn on a different gene, make different proteins. That is going to allow it to detect a stimulus and send a message to other parts of the body, okay? So your cells, they are genetically identical. The reason why they look different, because even though they have the same genes and the exact same DNA, they're going to turn on and off their different genes differently. Now, if we express a gene, that means that we turn it on. If we silence a gene, that means that we are turning it off. So when cells turn on and off or express genes differently, then they're going to make different proteins, which allow them to do different jobs and look like completely different types of cells. All right, so let's take a look at this next part of our notes here. And we've talked about cells, we've mentioned organelles inside of cells, but we're also going to talk about other words like tissues and organs and what's the difference between these things. Well, if you have a bunch of cells, okay, specialized cells, that means they're all different and they have a unique job, but they are working together to do a job for an organism. So for example, if we come down here, let's take a look at these cells. So they're all different. So each one is a specialized or a certain type of cell. But their job collectively is to create a barrier to protect the body from foreign particles. So it's like these cells are working together to form this bigger structure. And in this case, we say that these cells are coming together to form this structure, and this structure then is now called a tissue. So in this model, if we diagram how you're organized, how we have smaller structures that make up bigger structures, And as we get bigger structures, we get more advanced structures that can do more complex tasks. So we've got this model that shows that in cells, we have organelles. Organelles are the least complex out of all these structures, but they come together and they build a cell. And then when you have lots of cells coming together to do a job, then we say that we've got a tissue. Now, our tissues come together to make up even bigger structures, which are called organs. Organs come together to make up the body systems. So like you have your intestines and your stomach, and that will make up part of the digestive system. And then finally, you have different digestive systems that make up an organism. So you have a digestive system, but you also have a circulatory system and an immune system and so on. But all the systems make up an organism, which is the most complex out of all of these structures. So let's take a look at this part right here. So underneath tissues, you need to be able to tell me that there's 4 main types of tissues. So cells can come together and make up one of these 4 different types of tissues. Now, how we know if something is an organ is if a structure in the body contains all 4 types of tissues, then it's going to be classified as an organ. So here's the 4 types of tissues. You don't have to have these memorized. You just need to be able to tell me there's 4 types of tissues. And let's take a look at the stomach. So you know probably from studying the digestive system that the stomach is an organ. Well, why is it an organ? It's because it contains all 4 types of tissues. So there's muscle tissue. Our stomach has muscle cells in it. Nervous tissue. Our stomach has nerves in it. Connective tissue. Now that one is sometimes confusing for students, but an example of connective tissue is blood. So blood travels to different parts of the body and connects to different parts of the body. So it's considered connective tissue. And then we also have cells that line, and so that's called epithelial tissue. If you look at our stomach here, we're going to have blood vessels. That's connective tissue that contain blood. And then we also have cells that line the interior and the exterior of the stomach. So those are the epithelial cells making the epithelial tissue. So since the stomach has muscle, nerves, connective tissue, like blood and blood vessels, and cells that line the interior and the exterior, then we say that the stomach is an organ. So we go down here and take a look at the skin. Is the skin an organ? Well, we got to look for these 4 tissues. Is there muscle cells working together to do a job? Yes, you have muscle cells that work together to make your hair stand up. So there's muscle tissue. There is nerves. So you see nerve here and nerve endings. So there's nervous tissue. There's blood vessels. So there's connective tissue. And then we also have cells that form these layers that line that part of the body. So those are called epithelial tissues. So yes, the skin is an organ. It contains all 4 types of tissues. Now, as for our organ systems here, so these are some of the basic organ systems that I would expect you to know on the next page. And you just need a brief idea of what these body systems do. So nervous system, we're dealing with the brain, and let's indicate nerves, and they can detect changes in the environment. They can detect stimuli, and they can send signals to your brain and to other body parts so that you can respond. Your muscular system, those muscles that allow your cells to move. And also, I want to point out, this is really important in maintaining temperature. Because your muscles can generate heat, so that's going to help warm you up if you get cold. Your skeletal system is also involved in movement. Also protection. Think of the vital organs that are in the rib cage, like your heart and your lungs, and they're protected by the bone. So your muscles can attach to your bones, so then you can move, but also protection. Circulatory system, so the blood, the heart, your blood vessels help to move blood, and the blood is picking up O2. So let's show that, so let's just indicate oxygen is being moved around the body, and also a circulatory system is important of picking up CO2 so we can remove it. And also nutrients. So So nutrients make their way into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream carries it to your cells. Immune system, so those white blood cells, like I already showed you, those lysosomes, or have lysosomes that can help break down bacteria and pathogens, so that we're talking about defending against bacteria and viruses and other foreign particles. So viruses. Even when you breathe in pollen, your immune system reacts, and that's why some of you have allergies. And pollen would then just be plant cells. The respiratory system, so it's going to kind of work with the circulatory system. So you can breathe in oxygen. So why don't we show O2 going in, and then let's show CO2 coming out. So that's the primary job of the respiratory system. And we use the trachea, the lungs, and so on. Digestive system, so our stomach, our intestines, it's going to break down our food and help absorb it and put it in your bloodstream so it can be delivered. That's where those nutrients are coming from. And the excretory system, so this really has to do with like urine production, because urine is full of a bunch of waste. So we have to get rid of our nitrogenous waste. And that happens with your kidneys and your urinary tract. All right, so let's talk about all of your cell parts here. So your cells, your tissues, your organs, they're all working to maintain homeostasis. And what we mean, if you're maintaining homeostasis, it means you're keeping a constant, non-changing internal environment. So what are some factors that you need to keep constant? You don't want them to change, because then you won't feel very well. We've already talked about you need to keep your temperature, your body temperature constant. The amount of glucose in your blood, you need the right amount. You don't want too much, you don't want too little. You need the right amount of oxygen and CO2. If you have too much CO2 in your blood, it can make your pH go down. It can make you very acidic, and that can mess with your proteins. And so your respiratory system will say, breathe faster to get that CO2 out of there, okay? So your body is trying to maintain homeostasis, and all of these parts work together to try to help you maintain certain levels of things. Now, if we have to maintain certain levels, we do that through negative feedback. So we already talked a little bit about negative feedback. It's whenever a end or the result shuts down something a step earlier in the pathway. We talked about this with enzymes. So let's take a look at this negative feedback loop that helps you maintain a very constant body temperature. So let's say you go outside and it's a very hot day and your body starts to heat up because of the heat in the environment. So this is the stimulus. This is the signal. Your body temperature goes up. Your brain can detect it. Your brain can send messages to different body parts and they can respond. So your blood cells near your skin are going to get real wide. You're going to send more blood to your skin. And since blood is red when it goes to your skin, that's why your skin turns red whenever you're hot, because you've sent the blood to the surface. And then when the blood is moving through the skin close to the surface, the heat in your blood can then come out of your body and go into the environment. So you will cool off. That's what's going to happen. Your body temperature goes down. Now, since our body temperature has gone back down, this is no longer a stimulus. This is no longer happening. We don't have a high temperature anymore. So then our brain won't send signals to our blood vessels. Our blood vessels won't dilate, so it shuts down all of these reactions. If you have a situation where your body temperature goes down, again, your brain can detect it. It can send signals via nerves. So one thing that's going to happen, here's your muscular system. So there's your muscles. Your muscles are going to start to contract. Now, that's what shivering is. It's just your muscles contracting. And if you contract your muscles when you work out, you generate heat. So the more you shiver, the more you contract. It's really just a workout. You can't stop because your brain is making you work out. It's making you contract your muscles. We also aren't going to send as much blood to our skin. So notice here our blood cells were thick and dilated at the skin. But here at the skin, they're going to constrict. So we don't have as much blood flow close to the skin. Most of our blood is going to be diverted into around our internal organs because we don't want the blood near the surface. It releases heat. And that's why, since you don't have as much blood at the skin, you can look a little blue whenever you're cold. So whenever you shiver, when you send your blood away from the surface, you're going to retain more heat, you're going to make more heat, and your body temperature goes up. And so then now this is no longer true. That stimulus has been removed. It's no longer there, so it shuts down this process. So you'll stop shivering, your blood vessels won't dilate as much, and so that is all to help you maintain homeostasis.